Intolerance occupies a distinct position both within the development of Griffith's career, but also in the formation of the American film industry. In 1916, the year it was released, features had definitely taken hold. They were the main kind of production being made in the United States. And the scope and the ambition of Intolerance seemed to set the new standard for where features would go. In many ways, it seemed as though it would be the crowning achievement of Griffith's career up to this point. The Birth of a Nation, the feature that preceded Intolerance, had been a substantial and probably the biggest commercial success in the American cinema up to that point. And Griffith was poised to follow it with Intolerance. There was a lot of publicity about the filming of Intolerance in terms of the massive sets that had been constructed in Hollywood, and anticipation was very high for the film. At this moment, Griffith had made one feature film. Prior to that, he had spent 5 years at Biograph making hundreds of shorts. Those shorts had established Griffith's reputation as one of the most important filmmakers in American cinema. He had cemented that reputation himself by putting out an ad when he left Biograph, proclaiming that he was the architect of pretty much all that was significant in American cinema. In that ad, Griffith laid claim to having established cross-cutting, the close-up, and all sorts of other techniques which would be central to what we might call the grammar of cinema. A lot of these claims are dubious at best, but the point is that Griffith had the authority and the reputation within the American cinema to make those claims. And he carried with him the reputation of being America's foremost artistically motivated filmmaker. Birth of a Nation had been both a commercial and an artistic success, so that's why the moment of Intolerance was so important for his career. Unfortunately for Griffith, he took his ambition too far. Intolerance was predicated on the intertwining of 4 different storylines. It merges those storylines in such a way as to make them at times difficult to follow. And I think even more to the point, the way Griffith employs style in Intolerance goes far beyond what he did in The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation is not in any way unwieldy. It uses style in a way that very much amplifies the narrative thrust of the film. And so the cross-cutting, for example, is very much tied into moments of suspense and high tension, and one can understand the style as helping Griffith communicate the main points of the film effectively. In Intolerance, what we see instead is style being used almost autonomously. It often doesn't seem to have any direct connection to the narrative points of the film. Instead, it seems to exist for its own sake. For example, if one looks at the camera movement in the film, it's often autonomous. It doesn't direct us towards something that is narratively important. Instead, it seems to be just generating itself as something to look at. And this is true of other stylistic elements in the film as well. So what one sees in Intolerance is Griffith, in a sense, realizing his artistic ambitions, some would say to the detriment of narrative comprehension. That is why I think the film has this reputation as an art house classic. That can often be translated into meaning a film that people didn't really understand. And so what it meant in terms of its unique deployment of style is that it was moving away from the mainstream of what Hollywood cinema was coming to be. So Griffith became more and more an outsider figure from this point on. The failure of Intolerance meant that Griffith could not finance his own films as he had been able to do with Intolerance, that he was much more dependent on putting together different deals for each of his films. Some of them were successful, but he never regained the position he had at the moment of Intolerance's release. The other thing is that Intolerance marked Griffith, I think, as someone who was out of step with the way style was deployed typically in Hollywood films. And so Griffith never really served the role that he had up to that point, which was to be a kind of architect of the way that Hollywood filmmaking was meant to operate. Instead, he was seen progressively more as someone who was undoubtedly artistically gifted, but someone who couldn't really be seen as helping to move Hollywood towards its chief goals. If we think of Hollywood cinema in the teens and through the 20s as shaping decisively its adherence to what we call the classical style, we can see why Griffith is not someone who's going to be central to the development of that style. Intolerance is simply too odd in its use of style to be a template for how American cinema will develop. So while the epic ambitions of Intolerance are certainly informing subsequent films of its ilk, the stylistic method of Intolerance is something that Hollywood will by and large discard in the years to come.